Well, yes, of course. The thing with the Defence Legislation Amendment, and of course in brackets, Enhancement of Defence Force Response to Emergencies Bill, is one of those seemingly innocuous pieces of legislation that we tend to see from time to time. And buried in it, and buried in the detail, is of course the trouble. See it essentially as a streamlining mechanism. In other words, streamlining the mechanism by which the Australian Defence Forces and reserves would be called in to assist in dealing with emergencies. Now, the question, of course, is what is the nature of the emergency in question we're talking about? Supposedly, we're talking about natural disasters, but then it is very clear, according to the explanatory memorandum of the bill, that it, and to use its words, it will enhance defence's capacity to provide assistance in relation to natural disasters and other emergencies. And unfortunately, it doesn't leave those emergencies very clear. There is some suggestion that it might be civil strife and so forth, but that's sort of buried again in the second reading speech of the Assistant Defence Minister Alex Hawke. So it's worth noting that this bill has broad implications beyond the seemingly benign wording of it. The reality is that it's all based on good faith in terms of how ministers assess threats. So there's no oversight here. There's no judicial oversight, for example, about the conditions. There's no requirement for any committee involvement. There's no involvement of Parliament. It is very executive heavy, as it were, in terms of determining this. And it's also an unwarranted expansion in addition to what is already in place, which is the defence assistance to the civil community policy. So there's already the so-called DAC policy by which military assist, as it were, perhaps in certain civil operations or civilian operations, for example, bushfires, a natural disaster, and so on. But it is very clear that in this particular context, there is a broad and I would argue unnecessary enlargement of executive power. What is interesting, the backdrop to this, even more than that, in addition to that, is the anticipation of future crises, because the Australian Defence Force is very aware about the potential for crises emerging, for example, from climate change.
Yeah, and the idea of using climate change as the pretext as an emergency, I think it's different from other emergencies like bushfire season and things, which have a definite start and finish time. Whereas you can imagine climate change being something that's very ubiquitous across our whole society, and the timing is, it's ongoing.
That's a very good point, and because there's simply no end date and so on, there's no awareness about when it starts, stops, and so on, which makes legislation of this sort also dangerous, because any emergency legislation, by definition, that doesn't have limits, that doesn't have defined boundaries, is bad legislation and dangerous legislation. And that's the problem here. We've got open-ended commitments. We've got open-ended definitions about what a crisis would be. We've got open-ended contexts as to deployment of troops. And that is very troubling because it's simply too broad to be meaningful in any civil liberties sense.
Now, this very important information here is actually from the Bill's Digest that they publish on the government website. Like, they make sure they give all the information is available. They don't advertise it through, obviously, the mainstream media or press releases, but it's here if you want to go around and find it. So they haven't hidden it from you. So this is so important. So use of force during a Part 3A call-out is specifically regulated in Part 3, as I went over how they can search and go to people's houses, ask you questions, take documents. Now, proposed Section 123AA, this is the amendment, will extend immunity from criminal liability to both the ADF and other protected persons, which is the foreign military. That immunity will effectively permit ADF members and others to use force without criminal sanction in the good faith execution of their duties to the assistance to prepare, so it doesn't actually have to be in place, these natural disasters, respond to and recover from a natural disaster or other emergency as directed by the Minister. The circumstances in which the immunity will operate, i.e. the orders, are very broad, and the application of the immunity will be self-regulated by the Defence Executive. That's what I mean. They will be giving the orders. And the Digest interpretation, which they're telling you all about here, it continues. The immunity will have may have the unintended effect of permitting the domestic use of force by the ADF without the safeguards currently required, under the call-outs. That is one reading, as explored above. The provisions may allow what is, in effect, a call-out of the ADF on domestic operations without a call-out order being issued by the Governor-General, he's been taken out, and without notice to the Parliament. They don't have to tell anybody, the states and territories. Remember, a call-out order can only come from after a request from the states. They don't have to request that anymore. And or the general public of that order being made. So it can be entirely hidden. So yeah, this legislation is huge. As at today, 6th of November, the ADF only under a call-out have legislated powers over us. On the 9th of November, if this goes through the Senate on Monday, then they will, and not just them, these foreign forces.
Now, any time the term immunity is used, that should be incredibly troubling, because it immediately excludes the purview of the courts. That's the first thing. It also excludes the prospect that citizens can have enforceable claims in the event that their rights are violated and in the event that breaches take place. And yes, with heavy-handed use of force in instances like that, there should be some form of redress. But unfortunately, the bill not only provides immunity for ADF personnel and reservists in the discharge of their functions, there's also another sinister element to it. It also provides immunity for foreign personnel, for foreign military forces. So that is also very peculiar in a sense. It's very troubling that effectively blanket immunity is being provided across a range of forces in the use of this. So it's very clear that what is being envisaged here is a broader involvement of the military across the board, including Australia's allies. And this, I think, is also very troubling. I mean, it's a very clear statement in the bill that by doing that, they want to enable a more muscular response to take place in response to these unspecified crises and so on, which is incredibly troubling. So it all has the air of, punishing disobedience, civil disobedience or dissent and so on. And of course, the drafters would vehemently disagree with me when I say that, but I think the whole context of using immunity, the whole context of giving immunity to foreign forces, the whole idea about having such an inadequate human rights statement that gives no context about how public rights might be actually protected, and this meaningless term about good faith, which is a useless yardstick. So many of them might act in good faith in discharging terrible things, but that doesn't mean to say that there shouldn't be some kind of legal redress against the army in this context. That's another really troubling feature of that too.
So remember all these scenes during COVID where polite Defence Force members were standing there unarmed, just assisting under the DACC agreement that they have, the Operation COVID. Just they had no powers at all. Well, that was just conditioning everybody to get used to. It's the first step. They always do it in increments. First step in getting people used to seeing Defence Force in their face and even at their homes. Now, of course, there's been no impetus. There's been no events that have happened. Normally legislation comes in as a result of a trend, of a repeat, seeing things happening all the time. We better legislate that. There hasn't been, and in fact, it's the opposite. The existing arrangements, according to them, have worked really, really well. It's all been everyone hug each other, Defence Force, and everyone has been pretty accepting of these Defence Force personnel. There's no need to fire up at them. Just go along, if you're at a checkpoint and you want to take them on, you take on the cops, I guess. But these guys are just there, and people have been cooperating with them. So why do they need to give them guns and legislative power over us? It's not like they were getting resistance. Oh, these people aren't staying in line during COVID. Everybody stayed in line pretty much, and the police had, except for the protests where the police dealt with, and that they all got dealt with. They didn't need the Defence Force. So what is actually behind this legislation? Because they're bringing it in to use it